Hey guys, these are 10 more books that I consider mandatory reading. If you want to know the full list, you can see it on my website. The first book here is Drive by Daniel Pink. I thought this book was great. There's a whole bunch of books about success and what it takes to become a master and all that stuff. And I think this book not only goes into human motivations aside from financial motivations, and it does discuss financial motivations, but it also ties into what we need not only to achieve mastery, but to achieve self-fulfillment. I really did not expect this book to be as good as it was, but I've read it several times now over the years and recommended it to many people. Many of them have said, hey, this book was fantastic. You know, it really allowed me to understand my motivations and come up with a plan that is in line with those motivations. Now next is another book that is like supposed to be a science book or a general nonfiction book, but I consider it a personal development book, a self-help book, basically. The same with Drive. This is The Paradox of Choice by Barry Schwartz. Really excellent book, really clear, really great writer for nonfiction. It's really just like you're talking to an average guy, yet a lot of research, and he talks about such an important thing, that is the paradox of choice. And of course, most of us would be led to believe that more choice is better automatically. And after reading this book, I totally changed my mind about that. And this was many years ago, so I've been living by this actually, by eliminating choice in my life as much as possible. And I believe it has helped me tremendously, and many other people have said that as well. The other day I watched a best nonfiction book list by Mark Manson, the author of The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F, which I also gave a pretty good review to, by the way. But he had this book on his top list as well, and I agree, it is totally life-changing actually, because I never would have known that the abundance of choice in the modern world is actually bad for me. Bad for me psychologically, bad for me being satisfied with the choices that I do make, and bad for me wasting my time making all these choices. I don't want to say too much more about that book. I highly recommend it. Neither Drive or The Paradox of Choice are very big books. They're very medium-sized books, very accessible, very easy to read, and very profound. Next is one of my favorite books of all time as well. It's called Games People Play by Eric Berney. The theory that it's talking about is called transactional analysis. That sounds kind of complicated and kind of Latin to me, but they make it very, very simple actually. And I'm not going to be able to summarize it right here unless I actually did a video on it. But once you understand the games that people play, games such as Look What You Made Me Do, Poor Me, Let's You and Him Fight, and many other games that are talked about, once you recognize those games, now you don't have to play them. You can choose whether you want to engage in that type of a transaction with somebody. Now these games are introduced in order to avoid intimacy is kind of the heart of the thesis here. And like I said, I'm not going to do it justice, but these concepts to me were so profound that they absolutely changed the way that I interact with people, that I look at people. And I'm fortunate that I have friends who have also read this book, and so we can actually say, you're playing Look What You Made Me Do there, and we'll both kind of just stop, because those games aren't productive. They're not helping either of us emotionally, financially, physically. They're just ways to waste time, to avoid intimacy, to avoid confronting reality. You know, they're excuses often. Once you recognize games, even if people are playing them to a camera, you're watching a video, you can see that's a game, and I don't need to take this idea seriously. Not a huge book, but a super important book. I also like to read that book every single year, and I recommend it widely. It's an older book, by the way. I think it's like 50 years old. It's still just as relevant today, just as readable today, and it was a bestseller in its time, I do believe. It needs to be a bestseller again, in my opinion. It's so important. There is no new books about human relations, in my opinion, that are any better than that. And if we can all understand the three main roles of people, parent, adult, and child, and then we can understand that we need to interact with other people at that same level or at an appropriate level. A lot of the games people play, they put themselves into another position. Instead of being an adult to an adult, they play a game and now they're child to adult. Maybe you're being a parent to an adult and you're not that person's actual parent. Well, that's a problem, and I'd love to talk more about it. Maybe I will make a video just about that. I know there are other videos here on YouTube that summarize that concept, but I recommend reading that book multiple times. Next, I'll put a controversial book in here. I run a business in my regular life. If we do not make sales, our business does not survive. So this book, Sell or Be Sold by Grant Cardone, I think it's one of the best sales books that are out there. A lot of people have a problem with Grant Cardone. That's why it's controversial here. A lot of people think that because he's a Scientologist that we shouldn't trust him. Well, I'm saying I don't think you need to trust Grant Cardone, but he channeled the sales gods in this book. And it's on this list because even if you're not in business, and don't think that you're a salesperson or don't want to be a salesperson, a lot of people say that, I think you need to understand this book. I think you need to understand at least the opening chapters that describe very clearly that whether you think you're in sales or not, you actually are selling yourself all the time. You're involved in some form of sale all the time. You're convincing people or trying to convince people to take actions that you want, or you are being sold on something. From simple things like what to eat for dinner, what movie to see when you go out, to much more serious things like being in control of your own finances and time and all that. But if you're not selling, you're being sold. People say that if you don't have a plan and you're not working your plan, then you're working someone else's plan, right? Same thing. If you're not aware that you're involved in sales all the time, you need to change that. And once you are aware, you can now use easy strategies to get your way in life, or to get your way through the sales process, taking someone from information or interest to questions to objections into taking action. And whether you're selling a physical product or not, it doesn't matter. It's actually the same principles that apply to solving any problem or getting anyone to take any action. And I'd say that about 95% of that book is gospel, and the other 5 doesn't matter so much. There's not that much of actual Grant Cardone in here, so people who don't like his personality, there's not that much of Grant in here. There's a lot more of real, solid sales strategies and ways of thinking. Some things like the price myth in this book, chapter 6, I believe, so unbelievably important. Most people think that price is the issue with why they're not being successful selling something or convincing someone to do something. I promise it's most likely not the price, and this book will make it clear, and many other things clear. Highly recommend it. I've listened to this on audiobook maybe 100 times, maybe even more than that, literally, and it's not short. And the physical copy as well. Fantastic, mandatory reading. Next is the health book. This is a subject I'm not really allowed to speak much about. We're talking about pharmaceutical needles here, and the book is called Dissolving Illusions by Suzanne Humphries. It's a big book. It goes through the history of pharmaceutical needles. I've read several books that are also against pharmaceutical needles and that also cover the history. None of them did as good a job as Humphries, in my opinion. And of course, this is a very controversial topic. On Instagram, I don't talk about these things at all. It gets us in trouble with Instagram, puts us in the doghouse, and I don't have anything to gain by talking about these either. I'm not selling anything that has to do with that. It's not good for business, basically. But I believe this is super important. Most of us are injected with pharmaceutical needles before we can speak or assert our rights to medical freedom and medical choice. You know, we're injected as babies. So parents need to know this. Everybody needs to know this. This is a practice that has to stop. It's been based on totally false foundations. The reasons they give us that we need these things and the efficacy of those things are both wrong. We've been lied to. It's not a conspiracy theory. This is very well documented history, and you can have a look at it very thoroughly by a very level-headed author. Highly recommend it. Next is The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. This is a very famous book in the nonfiction genre, actually. If you read regular science books, you'll see a lot of books mention this. They will talk about the problems in science that are very well described in this book. And there's a saying in science that science progresses one funeral at a time because people hold on to old ideas. This is why it's difficult for scientific revolutions to take place, for new ideas to conquer old ideas. So this book goes into a lot of the biases and a lot of the reasons why people will continue to believe what they believe, the thing that they were brought up studying, the thing that their mentors taught them. They will hold on to those ideas for dear life. And this book talks a lot about the objective reality of this concept and also the psychological reasons and sociological reasons that contribute to it. Why does knowledge progress so slowly? This is why. Thomas Kuhn explains it. A lot of people get their information from the television and mainstream media, and they're presented it as if it's an objective fact. But if you understand the structure of scientific revolutions, you understand that false ideas can take hold within science, and it does it all the time. We have to be skeptical. We have to look at where the information came from. We have to look at the theory that's attached to it. If I think this idea is wrong, why do so many people believe it? Why is it so hard to move forward? Why is it so hard to examine evidence to the contrary of this thesis? Maybe that was too complicated. This book is actually pretty clear. It might even be more clear than how I just explained it. Next, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, Robert Kiyosaki. Classic book in my opinion, classic in the personal development, self-help, and financial help categories. Kiyosaki is another kind of controversial figure. Some people don't like him, some people think he's a bit abrasive, but this book is so simple. It's told in a story format mostly. It's like half story, half him basically giving you advice based on what you've already learned in that story. It's very swift, easy to read, it's easy to listen to, the story goes by like nothing. Should read it a few times in my opinion, but you really don't have to study it to understand it. It's just so clear, and those concepts are so important. I heard 100 people say pay yourself first. You gotta pay yourself first. You gotta pay yourself first. I didn't know what it meant. When you pay yourself, what do you actually do with that money? But that first rule, most people don't have any money because they don't do that first thing. So you can't invest any money if you don't have any money. You can't reinvest the gains of your investments if you never invested in the first place because you didn't pay yourself first. So incredibly important. I had to read more than one book to understand that concept, and Rich Dad Poor Dad was one of those books that I kept returning to because it was so clear. Again, just because you've heard it doesn't mean you're gonna do it. I had to read this and hear this so many times before I actually did it. And by the way, this book is more than just pay yourself first. There's a lot more covered, and I'm not gonna summarize it here fully. It's definitely worth understanding it in full. Not a huge book, not a difficult book by any means. I think anybody from 4th grade up can read that book. Next is another health book here. It's called The Ion Effect by Fred Soika. On the first part of this list in the last video, we had a book about EMF radiation, The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Furstenberg. Well, ions are similar but different. Mainstream science now believes that matter is both wave and particle, and it changes its form depending on the circumstance, depending on how you're measuring it. This goes deep into quantum physics, but we can all understand that basic level. Frequencies are important, but we must also understand the ion problem as well, and the ion effect. So just like bad frequencies affect us biologically, so do bad energetic particles, ions. Ions have a charge, positive and negative. One of them's good for you, one of them's bad for you. If you've got no positive or negative in your atmosphere, which can happen, it will affect you physically and psychologically. Very interesting. Not a huge book, but goes into sufficient detail, I think. And I don't know any better book to help you understand ions than this one. Next is a book I put on here recently actually, The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot. And when I gave it a good review on my Instagram, a lot of people said it's their favorite book or that it's on their top 10 list. And I believe it belongs there. It was a really, really good book. It talked about so much. Really hard for me to even summarize it, but it basically makes the case that this world is a hologram. And now that's not too far out there for a lot of people, because a lot of people are into simulation theory. It's quite mainstream these days. Well, the Holographic Universe takes it a lot further. And actually, this book goes into a lot of health stuff, like placebo and miracle healings and stuff. And I think this book actually covered that stuff better than a lot of books that are only about the placebo response. It's a very famous book, but everybody should still read it. Next, Mastery by Robert Greene. Now, Robert Greene is more known for his other books, especially The Art of Seduction, 48 Laws of Power, but I consider Mastery his best book. And it's one of the smallest ones as well, but it's very clear, very easy to understand, and very important. And I believe that most of us can and should achieve mastery, or at least strive for mastery, to become a master at what we do. Why not excel at what you do? But also in the real world, you're going to get financially compensated for having mastery, most likely. As long as you manage that properly, you should get paid more if you're better at what you do. And we can all get better at what we do. I think a lot of people make a lot of excuses that are covered really, really well in this book, and are covered in other books too, but this one takes the cake, I think, as the most clear and the most comprehensive about what to do to achieve mastery, what to expect, and what challenges we're likely to face along the way. I think more people would try to achieve mastery rather than pretending to be okay with mediocrity. If they understood that this is a long process and so on, that maybe they wouldn't give up so quickly, maybe they wouldn't create so many excuses, and maybe we'd have a much more interesting world with more people with more skills. More impressive artists, musicians, engineers, teachers, whatever you want to name, people who are better at what they do. I think this is key to a better world. Getting better at what I do has been key to improving my life. When I first read this book, when it first came out several years ago, I was at a different stage in mastery. I was still actually way back at the beginning. So I got a whole different level of benefit reading it back then. And then I read it again recently and realized a whole new set of benefits, because now I'm in the later stages. I've had several people say that this actually gave them the inspiration to really go for it in life, to really try to build a skill. They didn't even think about building a skill before they read that book. I've heard that. So I highly recommend it. The rest of Robert Greene's books, by the way, they've been so influential that I actually kind of consider them mandatory reading. Like, I'm not going to put Art of Seduction on this list, but I think you should understand it, because usually it's pretty obvious when people are trying those tactics, and you can notice that maybe you're not going to get pulled into a bad deal or work with people who may be misrepresenting themselves. So you should actually understand all of Robert Greene's works. I don't say that about very many authors, but if anyone's gonna hustle you, they've probably read 48 Laws of Power and Art of Seduction, so you can probably avoid those traps in life. And if you want to interact with other power players, then I think you should definitely understand a lot of what Robert Greene has to say, even if it turns you off. It turns me off, and I don't think it's a very pleasant view of humanity, but I think it much better prepares us to operate within humanity. Okay guys, that was 10 more mandatory books. Make sure to check out this video next. I appreciate you. Until next time.